My husband told me at 71, "I'm leaving for another woman. You'll get nothing." My lawyer screamed, "Fight!" But I calmly signed all the papers. He celebrated for a month. Then he opened a letter from the bank and, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled." People always asked me what the secret was. 51 years of marriage, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, a house in Connecticut with a wraparound porch, and a garden I'd tended since 1987. They'd look at Gerald and me at church dinners or neighborhood cookouts and say, "You two are the real thing." I used to believe them. My name is Dorothy Elaine Marsh, and I was 71 years old when my husband told me he was leaving. But let me start where it actually began. Not with the announcement, but with the silence that came before it. Because in a long marriage, the end doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It seeps in through the small cracks first. A missed dinner without a phone call. A weekend conference in Hartford that left no hotel receipt on the kitchen counter. Gerald had always been meticulous about receipts. He was an accountant for 32 years, after all. Suddenly, nothing. Just a quiet, practiced carefulness that felt entirely new. I noticed the phone first. He'd never been secretive about it. For decades, that man left his cell on the kitchen table like it was a piece of fruit. Then, one spring morning in March, I walked in while he was texting, and he turned the screen face down in a single smooth motion. It was so quick, so rehearsed, that I knew it hadn't been the first time he'd done it. You don't move like that by accident. I said nothing. That was always my way. I observed before I spoke. My mother called it patience. My daughter Karen called it stubbornness. I called it survival. The next signal came in April. Gerald began going to the gym. Now, I want you to understand something. This man had not voluntarily exercised since the Clinton administration. His idea of physical activity was walking from the sofa to the refrigerator during commercial breaks. But suddenly, he was up at 6:30, in new sneakers. I noticed the price tag ghost on the tongue of the left shoe, and driving off with a duffel bag I'd never seen before. He lost 11 pounds by May. Our friends noticed. Barbara Henley, who'd known Gerald since they were in the Rotary Club together, pulled me aside at a Memorial Day barbecue and said, "Dorothy, Gerald looks 20 years younger. What on earth are you feeding him?" I smiled and said, "Less red meat." But inside, something cold settled in my stomach and refused to leave. I started sleeping lightly. That's what suspicion does to you. It robs you of rest. I'd lie there in the dark, listening to the particular sound of a 73-year-old man breathing beside me and wonder, who are you becoming? And why are you becoming it without me? The answer came on a Tuesday in late June. Not from a private detective. Not from a discovered receipt. It came from Gerald himself, standing in our kitchen at 7 in the evening, still in his jacket from work, holding his car keys like he might need to leave again very quickly. "Dorothy," he said, "I'm leaving you." I was standing at the sink, rinsing a colander of green beans. I turned the faucet off slowly. "Her name is Renee," he continued. "She's 54. I've known her for 2 years. I'm going to move in with her next month." I set the colander down on the counter. "And before you ask," he said, "and this is the part I will never forget, not for a single day I have left on this earth. I've spoken to a lawyer. Everything is structured. You'll get the minimum the law requires, which, given how we set things up over the years," he almost smiled, "won't be very much. You'll get 0 of what you think you deserve." I looked at him. 51 years, the birth of 3 children, the burial of his mother and mine, Christmases and recessions and a cancer scare in 2009 that I held him through for 6 weeks while he wept into my shoulder at 2 in the morning. All right, I said. He blinked. He'd expected tears, possibly a thrown colander. All right, he repeated. I heard you, Gerald. He left the kitchen. I turned the faucet back on and finished rinsing the beans. And in that moment, with cold water running over my hands and the evening light going gold through the window above the sink, I understood something with absolute clarity. He had made his plan. Now I would make mine. I did not sleep that night. Not because I was crying, though I did cry privately in the downstairs bathroom with the fan on so Gerald wouldn't hear, but because I was thinking the way I hadn't thought since 1991, when Gerald's business partner tried to dissolve their firm and leave Gerald with nothing, and I was the one who sat at the kitchen table with the documents for 3 nights straight until I found the clause that saved us. I had always been the one who found the clause. By 4 in the morning, I was at the kitchen table again, this time with a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I wrote 2 columns. On the left, what I knew we had. On the right, what Gerald claimed I would get. The house in Westport, purchased in 1989 for $340,000. Gerald had always said it was worth about $800,000. I had reason to believe, from a neighbor's recent sale, that the actual market value was closer to $1.4 million. The deed was in both our names. That much I knew for certain, because I had been the one to sign the paperwork at closing. The retirement accounts. Gerald's 401k through his former firm, his IRA, and a brokerage account he'd opened in 2015 that he'd always referred to vaguely as my investment. I had been a co-signatory on our joint checking account for decades, but the investment account, I had only seen one statement early on when he'd left it open on the computer by mistake. The balance at that time had been $340,000. The pension, 32 years at Alderman and Cole Accounting. I knew the pension existed. I did not know its precise value, but I knew it was significant because Gerald had once told our son Michael that it was his insurance policy. I wrote all of this down. Then I wrote, in the right-hand column, Gerald says I get the minimum. I stared at that phrase for a long time. The minimum. I was 71 years old. I had a moderate arthritis in my left hip, a garden I couldn't maintain without income, and a Social Security benefit of $1,340 a month, because I had stepped back from my own career in bookkeeping in 1983 to raise our children, as Gerald had asked me to. The minimum would not cover my property taxes. Fear is a strange thing at 71. It's not the sharp electric fear of youth. It's heavier. It sits in the chest like a stone and makes the future look very small. That morning, I let myself feel it completely for exactly 1 hour. I sat at that kitchen table and I felt every ounce of it. The humiliation, the financial terror, the grief of a marriage that had apparently been ending for 2 years while I tended the garden and made Sunday roasts and genuinely believed we were fine. Then I got up, washed my face, and telephoned my daughter, Karen. Karen is a paralegal in New Haven. She is 44 years old. She has her father's sharp mind and my stubbornness, and she is the only person I trusted completely. When I told her what had happened, she was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Mom, don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. Don't even nod at anything until you talk to a lawyer." "I know," I said. "I have a name," Karen said. "His name is Robert Fitch. He's a divorce attorney. He's the one who handled the Palmieri case last year. You remember Sandra Palmieri from book club? He got her the house, the retirement accounts, and alimony until she remarries. He doesn't lose, Mom." I called Robert Fitch that same afternoon. He met me in his office in New Haven 2 days later, a Thursday, while Gerald was at work. Robert Fitch was 50-something, compact, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the focused energy of a man who genuinely enjoyed a complicated case. He read my notes on the yellow legal pad without interrupting. Then he looked up. "You've been married 51 years, he said. "Yes." "In Connecticut?" "Yes." "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "Connecticut is an equitable distribution state. That means marital assets are divided fairly, not necessarily equally, but a 51-year marriage, with demonstrated contributions from both spouses," he tapped my notes, "is going to yield significantly more than the minimum." Significantly. Gerald says he's structured things. Robert leaned back. Let him think that. That was the moment. That phrase, "let him think that," was where my plan was born. Not a plan of revenge, I want to be clear about that. I am not a vindictive woman. It was a plan of information. Gerald had spent 2 years preparing his exit. I had exactly one thing he didn't know about. I had just started preparing mine. I asked Robert 3 questions before I left his office. The first was about the pension valuation. The second was about the brokerage account and how to obtain its documentation legally. The third question was the most important one, and it made Robert Fitch smile for the first time since I'd sat down. "Is there any reason," I asked, "that Gerald needs to know we've spoken?" "Absolutely none," he said. I drove home on I-95 with the afternoon sun on the windshield, and for the first time since that Tuesday in the kitchen, I felt something other than fear. I felt the particular quiet that comes when you stop waiting for something to happen and decide to make something happen yourself. Gerald had celebrated in his mind already, I was sure of it. He'd told his Renee, no doubt. Perhaps they'd had champagne. Let him celebrate, I thought. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. The legal process began quietly, the way the most consequential things often do. Robert filed the divorce petition on a Wednesday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, Gerald had been formally served at his office at Alderman and Cole. He still consulted there 2 days a week in retirement, a fact I had counted on. I had not been home when it happened. I had been deliberately, carefully not home. I was at Barbara Henley's house, having coffee, establishing what any decent lawyer would call a verifiable alibi of normalcy. When I returned to the house at 4 o'clock, Gerald's car was already in the driveway, which was unusual. He normally didn't come home before 6. I noticed his briefcase was on the hallway floor instead of on the hook by the door, where he'd kept it for 30 years. Small misplacements. That's what shock does to a man's habits. He was in the kitchen. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 51 years. He looked uncertain. Gerald Marsh had always moved through the world with a particular confidence. Not arrogance exactly, but the settled assurance of a man who believed he had accounted for every variable. "You hired Robert Fitch," he said. "Yes," I said. I hung my cardigan on the peg by the door and put my keys on the counter. "Dorothy." "Gerald, I'd prefer if you directed your questions to my attorney." He stared at me, and I understood, in that moment, that he had not expected this. He had expected grief. Compliance. Perhaps a tearful negotiation conducted from a position of emotional weakness. He had not expected Robert Fitch. 2 days later, Gerald hired his own attorney, a man named Douglas Whitmore, who had an office in Stamford and, according to Karen's research, specialized in protecting high-asset clients in divorce proceedings. Protecting the assets from the spouse, that is. The message was clear. Gerald intended to fight. I was not surprised. I was ready. What I was not fully ready for was Renee. I had known she existed, of course. Gerald had told me her name that evening in the kitchen. 54 years old. That was all I knew. I had deliberately not searched for her, not online, not through mutual acquaintances. I didn't want my feelings about her to cloud my thinking. She is irrelevant to the financial matter, Robert had told me. stay focused. But Renee did not stay out of it. 3 weeks after the petition was filed, my neighbor Patricia, who lives 2 houses down and has always been, charitably, a woman who notices things, telephoned to tell me she had seen a woman parked outside my house for nearly 40 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon. Blonde, a silver Audi, writing something or looking at her phone. Patricia had taken down the plate number out of what she called pure instinct. I took the plate number. I gave it to Robert, who had a contact who could run it through appropriate channels. The car was registered to a Renee Gallagher, age 54, of Fairfield, Connecticut. She had been sitting outside my home. My home. The house where I had raised 3 children, planted 200 tulip bulbs over 30 years, and hung Christmas lights on the porch railing every December since 1990. She had been sitting outside it, watching. I felt the first real spike of anger then. Not the cold, clarifying anger I'd felt in the kitchen, but something hotter and less controlled. I sat with it, the way you sit with pain after a fall, assessing how bad it is. She is watching to see what I do, I realized. They both are. Good. Let them watch. And then, 10 days later, came the discovery that changed everything. Robert had filed a formal financial disclosure request, standard in Connecticut divorces, requiring Gerald to produce documentation of all assets, accounts, and income sources. Gerald's attorney had provided a package of documents, and Robert had sent me copies. I sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and read through them the way I used to read through contracts when I worked in bookkeeping, slowly, column by column, looking for what didn't match. I found it on page 11. Gerald's brokerage account, the one I'd glimpsed years ago at $340,000, was listed with a current value of $88,000, a loss of more than $250,000 in under a decade. I knew the market. I knew the returns. The numbers didn't make sense for a standard investment portfolio unless there had been significant withdrawals, significant losses on unusual positions, or, and this was the thought I couldn't dismiss, the account had been deliberately depleted in anticipation of divorce proceedings. I called Robert on Monday morning. "I see it," he said, before I'd finished my sentence. "Is it legal?" I asked. "To empty an account before filing?" "It's called dissipation of marital assets," Robert said. "And no, Mrs. Marsh, it is very much not legal." His voice had taken on a particular quality I was beginning to recognize, the quiet excitement of a lawyer who has just found exactly what he needed. "I'm filing for a forensic accounting." I set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked out the window at my garden. The roses I had planted in 2004 were coming into bloom. The June light was long and golden. So, I thought, he had been planning this even longer than I knew. The point of no return had been crossed, not by me, but by Gerald years before, in the privacy of a brokerage account he thought I would never examine closely. He had underestimated me then. He was still underestimating me now. That was his most expensive mistake. The forensic accountant Robert hired was a woman named Dr. Susan Pratt, and she was, in Karen's admiring words, a bloodhound in a blazer. She had testified in 47 divorce cases and, according to her own CV, had never once failed to locate assets that were being obscured. I met her once, briefly, in Robert's conference room. She had the polite, focused manner of someone who finds dishonesty deeply offensive on a professional level. I liked her immediately. Dr. Pratt worked for 3 weeks. Gerald and his attorney, Douglas Whitmore, were legally required to cooperate with her requests. They did so, but with the calculated slowness of people who believe that delay is a strategy. Documents arrived in pieces. Deadlines were met at the last possible hour. Whitmore sent Robert 2 letters complaining that the scope of inquiry was harassing and disproportionate. Robert responded to each letter with a single polite paragraph and continued exactly as before. I watched all of this from the house in Westport, which Gerald had moved out of in early July. He was living with Renee in Fairfield now. I knew the address because it was listed in the court filings. The house had a sudden, echoey quality without him in it. 51 years is a long time to share space with someone. Their absence has a sound. I kept busy. I documented. I photographed every room in the house for appraisal purposes, as Robert had requested. I organized 30 years of tax returns that I had kept in a filing cabinet in the basement, the kind of careful record-keeping that Gerald had always mocked slightly as Dorothy's Paper Museum. That paper museum, as it turned out, contained evidence of income patterns, asset acquisitions, and contribution histories that Dr. Pratt found extremely useful. And then, on a Thursday in late August, Gerald showed up at the house unannounced. He was not alone. His sister, Maureen, was with him. Maureen is 70 years old and has always believed that Gerald can do no fundamental wrong, a faith she has maintained through considerable evidence to the contrary. They stood in my doorway, and Gerald said they needed to talk. I let them in because I am not rude. We sat in the living room. Maureen positioned herself beside Gerald on the sofa like a second-chair attorney. Gerald began with what he clearly believed was a reasonable proposition. If I dropped the forensic audit, withdrew the dissipation claim, and accepted the settlement his attorney had drafted, the house at assessed value, no retirement account distribution, a token alimony, he would make sure I was taken care of. Taken care of, I repeated. Financially supported, he said. I'm not a monster, Dorothy. No one said you were. Then be reasonable. Maureen leaned forward. Dorothy, you're dragging this out and it's hurting everyone. Think about the children. Michael and Karen have had to take sides. This isn't fair to them. Karen chose her side, I said. I didn't ask her to. You hired Fitch, Maureen said, her voice rising. Yes, I agreed. I did. Gerald's tone shifted then. He had come in calm, performing reasonableness, but I had not given him the response he'd rehearsed for. His jaw tightened. Dorothy, I've spoken to Whitmore. If you persist with this audit, we are going to contest everything. The house value, your contribution claims, your work history, or lack thereof. We will make this expensive and we will make it very long. I understand, I said. You could lose. I might, I agreed pleasantly. He stared at me. This was not going as planned. Good, I thought. Maureen played her final card. She's going to destroy this family, she said to Gerald, speaking about me as though I had left the room. She's being vindictive. This isn't the Dorothy I know. I looked at Maureen. Maureen, I said, the Dorothy you know spent 51 years keeping her feelings to herself for the sake of domestic harmony. You might want to get acquainted with the other one. They left 15 minutes later. After the door closed, I sat very still in the living room. My hands, I noticed, were not shaking. My heart was beating harder than usual, but steadily. The threats had been real. Gerald had the money to make the proceedings longer and more expensive, and I knew it. Whitmore was capable. This was not yet won. But I also noticed something else. They had come here. They had driven to my house in person to ask me to stop. People only do that when they are worried. Still, the visit left its mark. I was 71 years old, and the weight of sustained conflict had accumulated in my body in ways I couldn't entirely will away. That weekend, I telephoned Karen and told her I needed 3 days. I drove up to my friend Louise's house in Vermont. She has a small place on Lake Champlain, and we have known each other since college. And I sat on her dock in the September sun and did very little. On the third morning, I watched the lake and thought about nothing. And in that silence, the decision that had been forming underneath all the noise became completely clear. I would not stop. Not because I was angry, because I was right. I drove home Sunday evening and called Robert Monday morning. Keep going, I said. I never doubted it, he said. The temptation arrived in a form I hadn't anticipated. Sympathy. Gerald was, I came to understand, running a quiet campaign, not dramatic, not confrontational. That approach hadn't worked in my living room. This campaign was softer, more dispersed, and frankly more skillful. It operated through social channels, the way destructive things often do in a community where everyone has known each other for decades. I first noticed it at the September meeting of the Westport Garden Society, which I have attended for 22 years. A woman named Claire Ostrander, a pleasant acquaintance, someone I'd always liked, sat beside me, and with great warmth and carefully arranged concern, said she'd heard things had been very difficult for me. She'd heard Gerald was devastated by the whole thing, that I was fighting it in a way that must be so exhausting. I understood immediately. Fighting it was a phrase Gerald would use. Specifically, Gerald. I'm not fighting anything, Claire, I said pleasantly. I'm simply participating in a legal process. She nodded with the expression of someone who was delivering a message and found its reception disappointing. At church the following Sunday, Gerald's friend, Hugh Pemberton, shook my hand after the service and said he hoped things would settle down soon. He used the word settle with an emphasis that felt slightly pointed. Gerald and Hugh had golfed together for 15 years. I thanked him and moved on. They were trying a different kind of pressure, I thought. Not threats this time. Social weight. The gentle, suffocating pressure of community consensus. Be reasonable, be quiet, accept the offered terms, preserve the peace. I was 71 years old and a widow in waiting, and the implied message was that difficult women of a certain age create their own isolation. I made myself tea that evening and sat with the feeling. Was I being tempted? Honestly, yes, a little. Not by the terms. I had no intention of accepting Gerald's settlement. But by the ease of it. The simplicity of surrender. The idea of all of this being over, the house quiet. No more legal correspondence on the hall table. No more depositions. I am not going to pretend the thought had no appeal. I let myself sit with it for exactly as long as it deserved. Then I thought about the brokerage account. I thought about the $250,000 that had been quietly moved or spent or sheltered while I was planting tulips and making Sunday roasts. I thought about Renee sitting in her silver Audi outside my house, watching, and the appeal faded. But I was wise enough to know that clarity fades too, under sustained pressure, without reinforcement. Which was why I am grateful, beyond what I can adequately express, for what happened next. My daughter Karen came for a weekend in October, and she brought my granddaughter Sophie, who is 23 and studying law at UConn, which is not a coincidence I take for granted. The three of us sat at the kitchen table on a Friday night with takeout from the Thai place on Post Road, and I told them everything in full detail for the first time. I told them about Dr. Pratt's findings so far, about Gerald and Maureen's visit, about Claire Ostrander's pointed sympathy at the Garden Society. Karen was furious in the efficient, focused way that made her good at her job. Sophie was quieter. She listened to everything with Gerald's sharp eyes set in my face, and at the end she said, "Grandma, what do you need from us?" I didn't cry often anymore, but I was close in that moment. "I need you to remind me when I forget," I said, "that I'm not being vindictive, that I'm being accurate." "You're being accurate," Karen said immediately. "You're being accurate," Sophie repeated. We ate our takeout. We talked about Sophie's classes and Karen's cases, and whether the big rose bush on the east side of the garden should be moved before winter. We watched an old film together on the sofa, the three of us tangled up in blankets the way we used to be when Karen was small. I slept soundly that night for the first time in months. Whatever Gerald and his circle were watching for, collapse, capitulation, despair, they did not find it. What they found, when the legal proceedings resumed in November, was a woman who had rested, reconnected, and arrived back at the table with all her paperwork in order. Robert called me on a Monday morning, his voice carrying that particular quality I recognize now as professional satisfaction. "Dr. Pratt has finished," he said. "You're going to want to come in." They came on a Saturday in November, all three of them. I say all three because this time Renee came too. I saw the cars from the upstairs window, Gerald's dark blue Volvo, and behind it, the silver Audi. I stood there for a moment and thought, well, here we are. Then I went downstairs, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove. Whatever was coming, I would face it having offered tea. I was raised in a particular way. I opened the door before they knocked. Gerald looked tired. That was my first observation. The weight he'd lost in the spring, the gym, the new sneakers, had partly returned, settling back around his jaw and shoulders in a way that made him look his age for the first time in months. He was 73 years old, and the process of dismantling a 51-year marriage had, apparently, not been as invigorating as he'd hoped. Maureen was beside him, her chin slightly elevated in the manner she adopted when she'd decided to be the reasonable one in a room. And Renee. She was, I noted, attractive in the straightforward way of someone who had taken deliberate care of themselves. Well-cut blonde hair, a cashmere coat, the posture of a woman accustomed to being chosen. She met my eyes without flinching, and I will admit she was braver than I expected. I let them into the living room. I brought the tea service, the good china, the one Gerald's mother had given us for our 20th anniversary, because I found a dark humor in it. I poured 4 cups. Renee took hers and held it with both hands, and for a moment she and I looked at each other across the living room without pretense. Gerald began. The approach was different this time, more rehearsed, more carefully structured. I suspected Whitmore had coached it. Gerald said he recognized that the process had become adversarial in ways that were damaging to everyone. He said he wanted to recalibrate. He proposed, and here the script became visible, that we agree to mediation rather than continued litigation. A private mediator of mutual choosing, informal. No forensic findings introduced. No forensic findings introduced. There it was. The forensic findings are already in evidence, I said. Robert has filed them with the court. Gerald's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. They can be discussed in a different context, he said. They are what they are, I replied, regardless of the context. That was when Renee spoke. I had not expected this. She leaned forward, set her cup down, and looked at me with an expression that had been constructed to appear frank and empathetic. "Dorothy," she said, and the use of my first name was, I noted, either brave or presumptuous, and I hadn't decided which. "I know this is painful. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I want you to understand that Gerald has been unhappy for a very long time, and prolonging this is only keeping everyone, including you, from moving forward." The room was very quiet. "He was unhappy," I said. "Yes." "For a long time?" "Yes." "And yet," I said, "during the years when he was apparently so unhappy, he was also transferring funds out of our joint marital estate. So I suppose we all cope differently." Renee's composure fractured, briefly, just at the eyes. Maureen, who had been quiet, seized the silence. "Dorothy, if you continue this, you are going to destroy Gerald's retirement security. You will take everything he worked for. Is that really the kind of person you want to be at this stage of your life? Is that really the kind of person you want to be?" The sentence was constructed to land like a moral judgment, and I felt it land. I will not pretend I didn't. There is something in a woman of my generation that responds to that particular accusation. The implication that claiming what is rightfully yours is somehow ungracious. I breathed. I looked at Maureen. I am the kind of person, I said, who spent 51 years contributing to a marriage, including by stepping back from my own career at Gerald's request, and who would like the marital estate to reflect that contribution accurately. I believe that is reasonable. Fitch has poisoned you against. I'll ask you not to speak about my attorney in that way in my house. The temperature in the room changed. Gerald stood up, and there was something in the motion that was not grief or exhaustion anymore. It was anger, the particular anger of someone who has miscalculated badly and knows it. "You are making a mistake," he said. His voice was low and controlled in the way that had once, long ago, intimidated me. It did not intimidate me now. "I'll take that risk," I said, and stood to indicate the conversation was over. They filed out through my front door, Gerald first, then Maureen, then Renee, who paused briefly in the doorway and looked at me once more. I could not entirely read the expression. It might have been respect. It might have been something else. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a moment. Then I sat on the bottom stair and let myself feel the fear, because it was there, genuine and cold. Gerald's anger was real. Whitmore was capable. Money could extend litigation. It could wear a person down. I was 71, not 40. I did not have unlimited energy. But here is what I discovered. The fear did not empty me. It filled me. It pressed against the walls of my chest and hardened into something that felt, unmistakably, like resolve. I will not be managed, I thought. Not by Gerald, not by Renee, not by Maureen, and not by the collective pressure of everyone who thinks I should be quiet because it would be more convenient. I got up from the stair. I went to the kitchen. I washed the teacups, all 4 of them, including Renee's, with its careful smear of nude lipstick, and put them back in the cabinet. Then I called Karen and told her what had happened. "Good," Karen said when I finished. "They're scared." "I know," I said. "Are you okay?" "I'm excellent," I said, and meant it. The deposition was scheduled for the 2nd Thursday of December. It took place in Robert's conference room in New Haven, a neutral space, legally mandated, with a court reporter and opposing counsel present. Gerald would give his testimony under oath. Dr. Pratt's forensic findings would be formally presented. And Robert, who had been building toward this moment for 5 months with the methodical patience of someone laying foundations for a cathedral, would ask the questions. I attended. I had the right to. I sat at the far end of the table in a gray wool dress and the pearl earrings Gerald's mother had given me, and I kept my hands folded on the table and my expression perfectly still. Douglas Whitmore arrived with Gerald and a paralegal. He was exactly as I'd imagined from his letters, large-framed, silver-haired, with the settled confidence of someone who had won many rooms through sheer presence alone. He nodded at Robert with the crisp cordiality of opposing generals before a battle. Gerald did not look at me when he came in. He sat at the opposite end of the table and arranged his papers with excessive precision. Robert began quietly. Background questions. Dates. Names. Account numbers. Gerald answered in the measured professional tone of a former accountant who knows how to present information selectively. Whitmore watched. The court reporter's fingers moved. Then Robert introduced Dr. Pratt's report. The brokerage account, the $340,000 that had become $88,000, was the centerpiece. Dr. Pratt's analysis had traced the withdrawals across 4 years, 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. Not losses. Withdrawals. Systematic, quarterly withdrawals, transferred in varying amounts to a second account that Gerald had not disclosed in his initial financial documentation. "Mr. Marsh," Robert said, "were you aware that marital assets transferred without spousal knowledge or consent may constitute dissipation under Connecticut law?" Gerald looked at Whitmore. "You may answer," Whitmore said carefully. "I managed my own account," Gerald said. "The account was opened during the marriage?" "Yes." "With funds that accumulated during the marriage?" A pause. "Yes." "And the funds transferred out of that account between 2019 and 2022, totaling, per Dr. Pratt's analysis, $264,000. Where were those funds transferred to?" Gerald's jaw moved. "Various places." "Could you be more specific?" "I'd need to look at records." "Mr. Marsh, you've had 60 days to prepare those records." Whitmore interjected smoothly. "My client is indicating he doesn't have that information immediately at hand." "Then perhaps," Robert said, turning a page, "you can explain the account in the name of GRM Holdings, LLC, opened in Delaware in 2018, with a registered agent address in Fairfield, Connecticut." The room changed. I felt it. A subtle shift in air pressure, the particular stillness that descends when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Gerald's face did not collapse. He was too controlled for that. But something drained out of it. The professional composure remained like a shell, but behind the eyes, I knew that face. Something scrambled. "I'm not familiar," he began. "GRM Holdings, LLC," Robert repeated pleasantly. "Gerald Raymond Marsh, the initials. Delaware registration is a matter of public record, Mr. Marsh. The entity was used to receive transfers from the brokerage account we've been discussing. Dr. Pratt traced 4 transactions totaling," he checked the page, "$211,000. Whitmore placed a hand on Gerald's arm. "I'd like to take a brief recess." "Of course," Robert said. In the hallway, through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see Gerald and Whitmore in tense, quiet conference. Whitmore was doing most of the talking. Gerald stood with his arms at his sides and his head slightly bowed, the posture of a man receiving information he did not want, or perhaps giving information he had withheld from his own lawyer. I looked at my folded hands on the table. 2 years, I thought. He spent 2 years preparing to leave me with nothing. And in those 2 years he was sitting across from me at dinner and sleeping in our bed and letting me think we were fine. I let myself feel it, the full size of the betrayal, for exactly the time the recess took. 17 minutes, by the clock on the wall. Then they came back, and I smoothed my face back into stillness. When Gerald returned to his seat, he looked at me for the first time since he'd walked into the room. I cannot tell you precisely what I saw in that look. Shame, perhaps. Something effortful and complicated. I held his gaze evenly and said nothing. Robert continued. By the end of the deposition, the following had been established on the record: the existence of GRM Holdings, LLC, the systematic transfers of marital assets, and Gerald's inability to provide a satisfactory account of the fund's final location. There was also the matter of a property, a condominium in Sarasota, Florida, purchased in 2021 in the name of GRM Holdings, that Dr. Pratt had located through property records. A condominium in Sarasota. I had never been to Sarasota. Whitmore asked for a 6-week extension to produce additional documentation. Robert agreed, pleasantly, and noted for the record that any further delay in disclosure would be reported to the court as non-compliance. The deposition ended at 4:15 in the afternoon. Robert walked me to my car in the parking garage. He was professionally restrained, but I could see the satisfaction beneath it. "Well?" I said. "He hid more than we thought," Robert said. "The Florida property alone changes the calculation significantly." "How significantly?" He named a figure. I stood in a parking garage in New Haven in December, with the smell of exhaust and cold concrete around me, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Just a deep, clarifying sense of accuracy, of the world finally reflecting what had actually been true all along. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Robert said, "Douglas Whitmore calls me, and we have a very different conversation than the one we've been having." He was right. Whitmore called the following Monday. The conversation was indeed very different. The revised settlement offer arrived on a Wednesday morning in January. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had made my yellow legal pad list 7 months earlier, and read through the 12-page document that Robert had sent over with a covering note that said, simply, "This is what winning looks like. The house in Westport, to Dorothy Elaine Marsh, in full. Market value assessed at $1.38 million. Gerald's 401k and IRA, divided per the qualified domestic relations order. Dorothy's share, 62%, reflecting her longer contribution period and the years she had forfeited her own retirement contributions to manage the household. The calculation was Dr. Pratt's, and it was precise. The pension from Alderman and Cole, divided per the QDRO. Dorothy's share, 50% of the accrued benefit, monthly payment beginning at Gerald's pensionable age. The GRM Holdings, LC, the shell company, the condominium in Sarasota, the funds contained therein, all declared marital assets by the court's preliminary ruling. Gerald was ordered to liquidate the LLC and the property, with Dorothy receiving 70% of the net proceeds as a dissipation penalty, per Connecticut case law. Alimony, $3,800 per month for 10 years, reflecting the disparity in their respective Social Security benefits and the career interruption Dorothy had incurred at Gerald's request in 1983. All attorney fees, paid by Gerald. All forensic accounting fees, paid by Gerald. I read it twice. Then I called Robert. "Is this enforceable?" I asked. "Every line," he said. Gerald signed it. Whitmore advised him to, once the Florida property was in evidence. Fighting it would have cost him more than settling, and the court's preliminary ruling on dissipation made the outcome of a trial fairly predictable. He agreed to all of it? He didn't have a great deal of choice, Mrs. Marsh. When you hide assets in a divorce and the forensic accountant finds them, the court tends to take a dim view. I looked out the window at the garden. January in Connecticut is not beautiful. The roses were cut back, the beds were brown, the light was low and thin. But I knew, with the bone-deep certainty of 30 years of gardening, exactly what would come up in April. "I'd like to sign," I said. I signed that afternoon at Robert's office. Gerald had already signed through Whitmore the previous day. I did not see him. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final exchange of words, just a stack of papers, carefully tabbed, and a pen, and my signature in the places Robert indicated. When it was done, Robert shook my hand. His grip was firm, and he held it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. 41 years of practice, he said. I don't say this often. Well done. Karen was waiting in the parking lot. She had taken the day off work to drive me. When I came out, she read my face and then crossed the distance between us quickly and held me. We stood in a parking lot in New Haven in January, and I let her hold me. And something that had been compressed and armored inside me for 7 months loosened and released. Not grief, exactly. More like the end of a very long-held breath. "It's done?" she said. "It's done," I said. She drove me home. We stopped on the way at the Thai place on Post Road and got takeout, and we ate it at the kitchen table, and Karen told me about Sophie's latest exam scores, and I told her about the bulbs I intended to plant in March, and it was almost perfectly ordinary. Almost. After Karen left that evening, I walked through the house alone. All 12 rooms, slowly. The room where Karen was born. We had a home birth in 1979, because that was something people did then. The study where I had kept my bookkeeping work before I stopped. The bedroom where I had held Gerald through 6 weeks of cancer fear, his face wet against my shoulder. I was not glad he was gone. I want to be precise about that. I was not glad. I was something more complicated. I was clear. I could see the shape of my life going forward without the distortion that panic and injustice create. The house was mine. My garden was mine. My resources were mine. I was 71 years old, and I was, for the first time in many years, in complete possession of my own life. Later that week, I received a letter from Gerald, handwritten, which surprised me. It was not an apology exactly. It was something more like an acknowledgement. 4 short paragraphs. He said he had not expected the proceedings to go as they had. He said he recognized that he had handled things poorly. He said he hoped, in time, things would be civil between us for the sake of the children. I read it twice. I put it in the filing cabinet, the paper museum, between 2 sheets of acid-free paper, because I keep things. I did not reply. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said, precisely and officially, in the settlement documents. The letter from the bank arrived 2 weeks later, addressed to Gerald at his old address, forwarded to Renee's house in Fairfield. I know this because Karen told me Gerald had called Michael in a state of considerable distress. The letter was from the bank that held the mortgage on the Sarasota condominium. GRM Holdings, LLC, having been ordered to liquidate, had ceased its mortgage payments. The bank was initiating foreclosure proceedings. Gerald would need to manage the sale, at a loss, in a hurried timeline, and produce the net proceeds for distribution per the court order. He had celebrated, I was told, for a month after our kitchen conversation. He'd gone out to dinner with Renee, opened champagne, told his friends the matter was settled. Then he opened the letter from the bank. What goes around, my mother used to say, goes around completely. Spring came to Westport, as it always did, without asking anyone's permission. By March, I had planted 230 tulip bulbs, a personal record, and hired a young landscaper named Theo to help me with the east garden bed that had always been too heavy for one person to manage. Theo was 22 and knew almost nothing about perennials, but he was willing to learn, and he showed up on time, which in my experience covers a great deal. I refinanced the house, as Robert had recommended, establishing a clean financial structure going forward. My monthly income, between alimony, Gerald's pension share, my Social Security, and a small amount from the investment account, was more than I had ever, during the marriage, controlled independently. It was a quietly exhilarating thing to sit down with my budget at the kitchen table and find that the numbers made sense, that there was room, that I could simply book a flight to see my college friend Louise in person rather than spending 2 hours on the phone because a plane ticket seemed extravagant. I booked the flight. I also returned, for the first time in 39 years, to bookkeeping. Not full-time. 2 clients, small businesses in Westport, who needed quarterly help with their accounts. I charged a fair rate and found, to my considerable surprise and pleasure, that I was still good at it. Numbers had not changed. The logic of them was the same. My brain, which Gerald had occasionally implied was suited to domestic management, but perhaps not much more, turned out to be entirely capable of professional work at 71. Sophie, who visited in April for spring break, sat at the kitchen table doing her law school readings while I worked on a client's quarterly accounts, and we worked in companionable silence. At one point she looked up and said, "Grandma, you look different than you did last year." "Different how?" I asked. She thought about it. "Settled," she said. "Like you're in the right place." "I think I am," I said. The Garden Society welcomed me back warmly, or most of it did. Claire Ostrander remained slightly awkward in my presence, the residue of that pointed conversation in September. I did not hold it against her. She was not a bad person. She had simply chosen the side she thought would win. Barbara Henley, who had known us both for 30 years, took me to lunch in April and told me, over salads at the restaurant on the harbor, that she was glad it had worked out. I never believed the version he was telling, she said. What version was that? I asked. That you'd become cold, difficult, that he'd been unhappy for years because of your attitude. She waved a hand. Gerald needs a narrative. He always did. You just never needed to control it. I thought about that for a long time afterward. And Gerald? He was living with Renee in Fairfield, in her house now, since the Sarasota condominium had been sold at a loss, and the GRM Holdings LLC account had been distributed per the court order. He had paid all legal fees. He had watched 62% of his 401k transfer into my account. He had, Michael reported carefully and without obvious satisfaction, adjusted his lifestyle significantly. Renee was not pleased with the lifestyle adjustment. There had been arguments, I heard through Karen. Renee had not entirely understood the financial scope of the settlement when she and Gerald had celebrated with champagne. The man she had chosen, the 73-year-old who had lost 11 pounds and bought new sneakers, had turned out to come with considerably fewer resources than advertised. I did not feel triumphant about this. What I felt was something closer to the absence of surprise. Gerald had always told the version of things that served him best. He had simply, this time, encountered a situation that did not bend to the telling. Maureen sent me a Christmas card that year. It contained no note, just her signature. I found this more interesting than any letter would have been. By the following spring, the second spring since that Tuesday in the kitchen, I had repainted the front porch, taken a watercolor class at the Community Arts Center, completed my first tax season as a practicing bookkeeper in 4 decades, and driven up to Vermont to see Louise twice. I also began, at Sophie's urging, writing down some of what had happened. Not for publication, just for myself. For clarity. To understand the shape of what I had lived through, what it had cost, and what it had given me. What had it given me? The house, yes. The security, yes. But those were the external answers. The internal answer was harder and more surprising. It had given me back myself. The self that had been patient for 51 years, and observant, and careful, and had kept everything in a filing cabinet just in case, and had known, on that Tuesday evening in the kitchen, with cold water running over her hands, exactly what kind of woman she intended to be. I had been 71 years old, facing the worst thing my marriage had produced. I had been completely, quietly ready. Here is what I learned. Know your own finances. Keep your records. Never sign anything in shock. And here is what I want to ask you, sincerely. If it had been you in that kitchen, what would you have done? Leave a comment. I read everyone. And if this story reached someone who needed it today, share it. Thank you for listening, my dears. Truly. My son wrote, "Don't you dare call me anymore. I'm tired of you in my life." I didn't reply a word. I simply canceled all the payments for his rent. A month later, he called me himself. What I did. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to make his favorite meal every Sunday. Pot roast with carrots and those little pearl onions he'd loved since he was 7 years old. I'd start it Saturday night. Season the meat. Brown it in the cast iron pan. My own mother left me. Then let it sit in the oven slow and low until the whole house smelled like something good was coming. Kevin would walk through the door around noon, kick off his shoes in the hallway, and say, "Something smells amazing, Mom." and I'd wave him off like it was nothing, like I hadn't been up since 8, making sure everything was perfect. That was the life I knew for the better part of 40 years. My name is Marjorie Ellen Caldwell, and I am 68 years old. I live in a yellow house outside of Dayton, Ohio, on a street lined with maple trees that go orange and gold every October. My husband Frank passed 11 years ago. Cancer, fast, unkind. And after that, it was just me and the pot roast, and the Sunday visits, and the belief, deep and unexamined, that family was the thing you held on to when everything else went. Kevin was our only child. Frank and I had tried for more, but it didn't happen. And so we put everything into that boy. Every school play, every little league game, every science fair project where I typed his bibliography at midnight because he'd waited too long. I'm not saying I was a saint. I made mistakes. But I loved that boy with every cell in my body, and for most of his life I believed he loved me back. He met Tiffany when he was 34. She was younger, 30, with straight blonde hair and a way of smiling that never quite reached her eyes. I tried not to notice that. I told myself I was being an unfair mother-in-law, one of those women I'd always pitied and vowed never to become. So I was careful. I bought her birthday gifts. I asked about her sister's wedding. I made sure the guest room had good towels when they visited. But things shifted slowly, the way water carves a canyon. You don't see it happening until the landscape has already changed. The Sunday visits became every other Sunday, then once a month. Then, "We're really busy, Mom. We'll try to make it next week." The phone calls got shorter. Kevin started texting instead of calling, and the texts got further apart. I told myself it was just life. They were busy, they had careers, they had friends their own age. I told myself that was normal. What wasn't normal was what I was paying for. Let me back up. When Kevin and Tiffany got married, they moved into an apartment in Columbus. A nice one, 2 bedrooms, granite countertops, one of those buildings with a gym and a rooftop terrace. Kevin was working in sales at the time, and Tiffany had just switched jobs. They were a little stretched. Kevin called me, not texted, called, and asked if I could help with rent for a few months, just until they got on their feet. It was $1,650 a month. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. That was 6 years ago. The few months became a year. The year became 2. I brought it up, gently, once, and Kevin said they were still rebuilding their savings after some unexpected car repairs and Tiffany's dental bills. He sounded tired and a little ashamed, so I let it go. Another year passed, then another. By the time Kevin sent me that message, I had paid 81 months of rent. I had given that apartment, and by extension, my son and his wife, just over $133,000. I didn't know that number yet on the morning I read his text. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee, still in my robe, watching the birds at the feeder Frank had built the summer before he got sick. It was a Tuesday in March. Nothing about it felt like the kind of morning your life changes. My phone buzzed. Kevin's name lit up the screen. I opened it expecting, what? A question about Easter dinner, a photo, something normal. Instead, I read, "Don't ever call me again. I am tired of having you in my life." I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone face down on the table and looked out at the birds. The cardinal was there, the one that came every morning. Frank always said cardinals were visits from people you'd lost. I watched it for a long time. I didn't cry right away. I didn't respond. I just sat there in my yellow kitchen in my robe, holding my coffee cup with both hands, feeling the heat go out of it, while something else, something I couldn't name yet, began, very quietly, to go cold inside me. I didn't eat that day. I'm not sure I moved from that chair for the better part of 2 hours. The birds came and went. A neighbor walked her dog past the window. The world outside kept its schedule, indifferent and ordinary, while I sat inside mine, trying to understand what had just happened. Had I done something? I turned the last weeks over in my mind, the way you worry a loose tooth, carefully, compulsively. Our last phone call had been 2 Sundays before, and it had seemed fine. Kevin mentioned he and Tiffany were looking at new furniture for the living room. I asked about his job. He said things were good. He said, "I'll call you next week, Mom." He hadn't. But that wasn't unusual anymore. The week before that, a text. A photo of their dog, Biscuit, a golden retriever I'd met exactly twice, wearing a little Halloween bandana even though it was March. I'd written back, "Biscuit is adorable. Miss you both." Kevin had replied with a thumbs up emoji. A thumbs up emoji. Was that the last real communication? A thumbs up? I made myself get up and shower. I made myself eat half a piece of toast. And then I sat back down at the table with a legal pad. Frank's old habit, I'd inherited it. And I started writing things down. Not because I had a plan yet, because I needed to see the shape of what I was dealing with. At the top of the page, I wrote, "What do I actually know?" I knew Kevin had a wife who didn't like me. I'd suspected that for years without letting myself say it plainly. I knew the visits had stopped. I knew I was paying $1,650 a month for their apartment. And I knew my son had just told me, in capital letters, that he was tired of having me in his life. I turned to a clean page. I wrote, "How long have I been paying rent?" I went back through my bank records. I use online banking. Frank made me learn it before he passed, bless him. And I started counting. The first transfer was dated September, 4 years before last, and they'd been monthly since. I found the earliest and counted forward. 81 payments, $1,650 each. I wrote the number at the bottom of the column and stared at it. $133,650. My hands felt strange, not shaky, more like hollow, like the bones had been removed. That wasn't grocery money. That wasn't a birthday gift. That was nearly my entire savings outside of Frank's pension and the equity in this house. I had given it slowly, month by month, the way you don't notice a leak until you check the basement and find the water up to your knees. And now, my son had told me not to contact him, in capital letters. I thought about calling my friend Dorothy. We've been friends since Kevin was in diapers. She lives 3 streets over. But I stopped myself. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Saying it out loud would make it fully real, and I needed to think first. Here is what I was afraid of, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was afraid I had done something wrong without knowing it. I was afraid that maybe Tiffany had a legitimate grievance I was unaware of, that maybe I'd said something at Christmas 3 years ago, or that Kevin had finally admitted to her that he felt smothered. Mothers can smother. I knew that. I did not believe I was that kind of mother, but what if I was wrong? I sat with that fear for most of the afternoon. And then, somewhere around 4 o'clock, with the light going golden through the kitchen window, a different thought arrived. Even if I had done something wrong, even if I had committed some offense I was unaware of, did that warrant $133,650? Was that the price of whatever my sin was? I tore off the page with the number and looked at it for a long time. Then I folded it carefully and put it in the front pocket of my purse, where I keep things I need to remember. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would come later. What I felt in that moment was something quieter and more deliberate. Clarity. The kind that comes when you stop trying to make something make sense and start dealing with what's actually in front of you. I opened my bank's website. I navigated to the recurring payment I had set up 6 years ago, $1,650 monthly, to the account Kevin had given me. I looked at the cancel button for a long time. Then I clicked it. I confirmed the cancellation. I watched the screen update. No dramatic music, no thunder, just a small white confirmation notice on a blue screen. Recurring payment canceled. I closed the laptop and went to put the kettle on. I had no idea what would happen next. I had no plan beyond that one action. But I had stopped the bleeding, and that felt, for the first time all day, like the right thing to do. More than right. Necessary. The kettle whistled. I made my tea. Outside, the cardinal was back at the feeder. What would Frank have done? I asked myself that. He would have done exactly what I just did, I decided, and then he would have talked to a lawyer. Frank was practical that way. He always said, "When in doubt, find someone who knows more than you do." I picked up my phone and called my attorney, Martin Schreiber. We'd worked together years ago on Frank's estate. I left him a message asking if he had time to meet that week. That was my first step. Quiet, deliberate, and entirely irreversible. Martin Schreiber had been Frank's lawyer before he was mine, and he had one of those faces that made you feel like whatever problem you'd walked in with was manageable. Not dismissible. He took things seriously. But manageable. He had an office downtown in a building that smelled like old carpet and coffee. And when I sat down across from him that Thursday morning, he listened to the whole story without interrupting once. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Marjorie, do you have documentation of all these transfers?" "I have 6 years of bank records," I said. "I printed them last night." I slid the folder across his desk. He opened it. He turned pages slowly. "No written agreement?" he asked. "No loan documents? No emails where Kevin acknowledged this was anything other than a gift?" "No," I said. "He called me. It was always a phone call." Martin nodded, still reading. "What about texts?" That gave me pause. I had saved texts for years. Not intentionally. I'd just never deleted them. I was that person. I told Martin, and he said I should go through them carefully and look for any message where Kevin referred to the payments in any context, even casually. Any acknowledgement in writing that the money existed and what it was for. "I can't promise it changes your legal position," he said carefully. "Money transferred to an adult child without a written agreement is generally presumed to be a gift under Ohio law. Recovering it is difficult." "I don't care about recovering it," I said. He looked up. "I just needed to understand what I was dealing with," I told him. "I needed someone else to look at it and tell me I wasn't crazy." He put the folder down. "You are not crazy," he said. "This is a significant financial loss, and the circumstances you're describing, the escalating distance, the sudden hostile message after 6 years of payments, raise real questions about what was happening in that household." I drove home with a cleaner feeling in my chest. That night, I went through every text conversation with Kevin, going back 4 years. The oldest ones my phone still held. Most were brief. Weather, holidays, the dog. But I found 3 messages that stopped me. The first was from 2 years ago, November. Kevin had texted, "Thanks for the rent this month. Things are still tight, but we're working on it." Simple. Throwaway. But it was an acknowledgement in writing that he knew about the payments and that they were ongoing. The second was 14 months ago. He'd written, "Hey, Mom, can you do $1,800 this month instead? Landlord raised it, I'll explain later." I had replied, "Of course, no problem." And I had increased the transfer. I sat with that one for a long time. He had asked for more, and I had given it without question. The third message was 8 months ago. This one made my jaw tighten. It was Tiffany. She'd used Kevin's phone, I could tell by the writing style. She'd texted, "Hi, Marjorie. Kevin's at work. Just wanted to say the place is really coming together. We got those new couches we've been looking at. New couches. While I was paying their rent. While my grocery budget had been quietly shrinking for 2 years because of a few months of financial help. I photographed all 3 messages. I emailed them to Martin. Then I sat back and thought about what was actually happening in that apartment in Columbus. Was Kevin aware that I had canceled the payment? Not yet. The next payment date was still 12 days away. He had no idea anything had changed. He had presumably told me never to call him again, blocked any response from me, and was sitting in his apartment, on his new couches, fully expecting that $1,800 to land in their account in less than 2 weeks. Did Tiffany know about the message he'd sent me? Almost certainly. Those two were a unit. And here was the question that unsettled me most. Lying in bed that night, with the house very quiet around me. Had she written it for him? The capitalization, the directness, the finality? It hadn't sounded entirely like Kevin. Kevin was passive in his cruelty. He didn't confront. He withdrew. But that message had been a door slammed, not a door quietly closed. I didn't sleep well. But when I woke up at 6, something had crystallized. I called my niece, Patricia, Frank's sister's daughter, who works in banking in Cincinnati. Not to ask for help, not yet, but to ask her a question. I said, Patricia, if someone has been receiving money from a family member for 6 years and calls it rent help, does that ever appear on financial documents? Mortgage applications, loan applications, anything like that? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Marjorie, are you asking me what I think you're asking me? I'm asking a hypothetical. Another pause. Hypothetically, she said, if a person was listing their income on a loan application and had been receiving regular monthly transfers for years, the absence of those transfers, suddenly, right before an application went in, could complicate things significantly. I thanked her and hung up. I didn't know if Kevin and Tiffany were in the middle of anything financial, but I had a feeling, the kind that starts in your spine and works outward, that they might be. The new furniture, the mention, last fall, of looking at houses in a good school district, the quiet that had preceded that message. They had been planning something that required me to be a reliable source of income and nothing else. I was beginning to understand the shape of it. The first payment date came and went. No deposit. No $1,800 arriving in Kevin's account on the 15th of the month, the way it had for 81 consecutive months. I sat at my kitchen table and watched the date pass, the way you watch a storm move across a field, at a distance, with full attention. I had expected the phone to ring that day. It didn't. I had expected it the next day. Still nothing. By the 3rd day, I started to wonder if perhaps I'd been wrong about everything, about Tiffany's calculations, about the house search, about all of it. Maybe Kevin genuinely didn't want my money anymore. Maybe his message had been the beginning of a clean break, financial and otherwise. Maybe the silence was him saying, "We're done. We don't need you." On the 4th day, at 7:20 in the evening, my phone rang. Kevin's name on the screen. I let it ring 4 times. Then I answered. Mom. His voice was different from how I remembered it. Tighter. I need to talk to you. Hello, Kevin, I said. The rent payment didn't come through. I know. Silence. Then, there must have been some kind of bank error. Can you look into it? I had prepared for this. I'd said the words to myself in the bathroom mirror the morning before, which made me feel slightly ridiculous, but it had helped. There's no bank error, I said. I canceled the payment. Another silence. Longer. You canceled it, he repeated. Yes. After everything, He stopped. Started again. Mom, we're in the middle of something. This is not a good time for this. Kevin, I said, you told me not to call you again. You told me you were tired of having me in your life. I didn't call you. You called me. I heard him exhale. I heard in the background Tiffany's voice, low and urgent, saying something I couldn't make out. That was a moment, Kevin said. I was frustrated. You know how I get. I do know, I said. Yes. So you'll set the payment back up. It wasn't a question. That was the thing that cut through whatever remaining maternal softness I'd been holding. He hadn't said, I'm sorry, Mom. He hadn't said, I miss you. He'd called to restore service. I was a utility to him. I was the internet going out. I won't, I said. I wish you both well. I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. I didn't answer. It rang 6 more times over the next 2 hours. I sat on the couch with a cup of chamomile tea and my library book, and I let it ring. Then the texts started. Kevin, Mom, pick up. Kevin, this is serious. We need to talk. Kevin, you have no idea what you're doing. And then the one that wasn't Kevin's voice at all. Marjorie, this is Tiffany. What you're doing is cruel and manipulative. Kevin has been under enormous stress, and you pulling this stunt right now is going to have consequences. I suggest you think very carefully. I read that one 3 times. Consequences. I photographed the screen. I emailed it to Martin that night. The next morning, it escalated. Kevin called again, and when I answered, I wanted to hear what they'd say next. He was different. The tight politeness was gone. He told me that if I didn't restore the payment, he would talk to people about what I'd done over the years. I asked him, calmly, what exactly he meant. He said that I had interfered in their marriage, that I had inserted myself into their finances as a form of control, and that he could make that case to a family court if it ever came to it. Family court. Over rent I had voluntarily given him. I said, Kevin, I'd encourage you to discuss that plan with an attorney before you pursue it. He hung up. That afternoon, Martin called me after receiving my forwarded texts. He told me that Tiffany's message, specifically the word consequences alongside a demand for money, could be interpreted as a form of financial coercion, and that I should continue to document everything. I told him I was. Are you all right? Martin asked. I'm tired, I said honestly. But I'm all right. I spent the next 3 days doing very little. I went to Dorothy's house and sat in her kitchen while she made soup. I walked the neighborhood in the evenings. I slept later than usual, which I never do. I needed the quiet. I needed to let my nervous system understand that what had happened had not killed me, that the earthquake I'd been afraid of for years had finally hit, and I was still standing in my yellow house on my maple-lined street. On the 3rd evening, sitting in Dorothy's kitchen with a bowl of minestrone, I told her the whole story, beginning to end. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she put her hand over mine and said, Marjorie, I always wondered when you were going to see this clearly. You knew? I asked. I suspected, she said, but it wasn't my place. We sat there for a while in the warm kitchen while the soup pot ticked on the stove. What are you going to do? She asked. I already did it, I said. They tried the soft approach next. 11 days after my last exchange with Kevin, 11 days of silence. I received a text that was so carefully worded I could almost see Tiffany drafting it, deleting, redrafting. It came from Kevin's number. Mom. I've been thinking. I know things have been hard between us. I don't want it to be like this. Can we maybe meet for coffee? I read it at my kitchen table with my morning coffee. Same chair, same birds at the feeder. The cardinal was there. Here's what I noticed. He had not apologized. He had not mentioned the original message, the "Don't ever call me again," not to withdraw it, not to explain it, not to acknowledge it existed. He had also not mentioned the rent. The text was written as though we'd had a small disagreement about something minor, the kind of thing you smooth over with a cup of coffee. What Kevin did not know, what neither of them knew, was that in those 11 days, while I'd been quiet and appeared to be waiting, I had not been idle. I had met with Martin twice more. I had pulled together a full financial accounting of everything I'd paid over 6 years. The original $1,650, the increase to $1,800 14 months ago, the occasional additional amounts when Kevin had mentioned unexpected expenses, a total of $138,200 when calculated precisely. Martin had helped me draft a simple personal record document, notarized, stating the history of the payments, their voluntary nature, and the dates of the communications I'd received. I wasn't pursuing legal action. Martin had been clear, and I understood, that voluntarily given money to an adult child without a contract was nearly impossible to recover under Ohio law. That wasn't the point. The point was documentation. The point was knowing exactly what had happened, in ink, with a notary's stamp, in case it ever needed to be known by someone else. Martin had also, at my request, sent a brief formal letter to Kevin, not threatening, purely informational, stating that I had retained counsel and that any future communications regarding financial matters should go through his office. Not a lawsuit, not an accusation, just a line drawn clearly in the open air. That letter had arrived at Kevin's address 4 days before his coffee invitation, which is why the coffee invitation did not move me. I wrote back, "Kevin, I hope you're well. I'm not in a position to meet right now. Take care of yourself." Short. Warm enough not to be cruel. Final. He tried twice more in the following week. Once with a longer message about how he'd been under stress at work, how Tiffany had been struggling emotionally, how he regretted things but needed me to understand his side. Once with a photo of Biscuit, the golden retriever, lying on a couch with soft light coming in through a window. "Thought you'd like this," he wrote, with no other context. The dog photo almost worked. I won't pretend otherwise. There's a specific kind of pull when someone uses something innocent and sweet to reach you. For about 4 minutes, I sat there thinking about how much I had always wanted a dog, how Frank had been allergic, how Kevin had grown up wanting one too. Then I thought about $138,200. I put the phone down. What had helped me most in those weeks, more than Martin, more than my own resolve, was a grief support group that met on Wednesday evenings at the community center on Elm Street. I'd started going 8 months earlier, originally because of a difficult anniversary of Frank's death, and I'd kept going because the people there were real. Retired teachers, widows, a man named Gerald who'd lost his daughter to addiction, people who had survived loss and were figuring out how to carry it. I told them what had happened. Not everything, not the money, just, my son told me he was tired of having me in his life. And the room got very quiet. Gerald said, "Did he mean it? Or was he testing you?" "I don't know," I said, "but I've decided to let him mean it." The woman next to me, Vera, 72, a retired piano teacher, put her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Walking to my car afterward, with the night air cool and the parking lot half lit, I realized something. I was not alone. I had Dorothy and Martin and Gerald and Vera and this small circle of honest people. I had Frank's memory, which was a kind of company all its own. What I did not have was anxiety. That was the thing that surprised me most in those weeks. I had expected to feel afraid of Kevin's anger, of the estrangement becoming permanent, of waking up at 75 with no son. And I did feel those things, in quiet, passing waves. but underneath them was something I hadn't felt in a long time. Steadiness. My own steadiness. The kind that comes not from being certain everything will turn out right, but from knowing you made the right choice. I paid my own rent that month, my own bills. I bought a small orchid for the kitchen windowsill. I slept well. They came to the house on a Saturday. I hadn't been warned. I was in the backyard pulling dead stems out of the garden bed when I heard a car in the driveway. By the time I'd walked around to the front, Kevin was already standing on the porch, his hands in his jacket pockets, and Tiffany was coming up the front walk behind him. She was carrying a dish, something covered in foil. I stopped on the path. The last time I'd seen Kevin in person was 7 months ago at a brief, stiff lunch in Columbus that Tiffany had cut short, claiming a headache. Before that, Christmas. I took in the sight of him. He looked thinner, or maybe just tired, with shadows under his eyes. Tiffany looked the way she always looked, put together, neutral, unreadable. "Mom," Kevin said, "we were in the area. Thought we'd stop by. Dayton to my house is 90 minutes from Columbus. Nobody is in the area." "All right," I said. I opened the door and let them in. In my kitchen, Tiffany set the foil dish on the counter. "A casserole," she explained. She'd made it herself. She was very pleasant saying this. A deliberate, careful pleasantness that I recognized from her best performances at family holidays. Kevin sat at the table. He looked around the kitchen the way people do when they're building up to something. I made coffee. I let them settle. I waited. Kevin spoke first. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he missed me. He said the things he'd written in that message had been said in a moment of anger and exhaustion, and he wasn't proud of them. He said quietly that Tiffany had helped him understand that he needed to work on communication. I noticed he still hadn't said the word sorry. Tiffany took over smoothly, the way a relay runner grabs a baton. She said she knew things had been difficult. She said she'd always admired me and wanted a real relationship. She said, looking at me very directly, with those eyes that had never quite smiled, that she hoped we could all move forward as a family. I sipped my coffee. "What does moving forward look like?" I asked. Kevin shifted in his chair. Tiffany's expression didn't change. "We were thinking," Kevin said, "that maybe we could reset things, start fresh, the three of us. Regular dinners, Sunday visits, the whole thing." "That sounds nice," I said. Kevin visibly relaxed. Tiffany's posture eased slightly. "And obviously," Kevin said, more carefully, "with things back to normal, the financial arrangement could go back to what it was." There it was. I set my cup down. I looked at him. I thought, there it is. The foil dish on the counter. The mention of missing me. The "we were in the area." The entire architecture of this visit. "Kevin," I said, "I love you. I want you to know that hasn't changed, but I won't be resuming the payments." The room changed. It was subtle. The air pressure shifted. "Mom." "I paid your rent for 6 years," I said. $138,000. I did that because I loved you and I believed you needed it. I don't regret it. But it's done now." Tiffany's pleasantness dissolved, not dramatically. She didn't raise her voice. But the warmth vacated her face like a light going out, and what was underneath it was something I can only describe as calculation. "Marjorie," she said, "I think you're letting hurt feelings make a financial decision that affects all of us." "I think that's accurate," I said. "Yes." "You're punishing Kevin," she said. "After everything we've been through together as a family, you're choosing money over your relationship with your son." "Tiffany," I said, "I didn't make any demands. I didn't ask for anything to change. Kevin sent me a message telling me never to contact him again. I respected that. You are both here, in my kitchen, because you want the payments restored. That's not me putting money over family. That's me declining to fund a family that has no room for me in it." Kevin stood up. His jaw was tight. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You don't know everything that's going on." "Then tell me," I said. "Tell me what's going on." He didn't. He looked at Tiffany. She looked back at him. Some communication passed between them that excluded me entirely, and I saw, in that quick, shut glance, the whole shape of what I'd been living inside for years. I was not part of their unit. I was adjacent to it. A resource. "We should go," Tiffany said. She picked up her purse. Kevin followed her. At the door, he turned back and said, and this was the thing that stayed with me, "Don't come looking for us when you're lonely, Mom." That's all I'm going to say. The door closed. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. My hands were trembling slightly, and I wasn't sure whether it was anger or something older and sadder. I looked at the casserole dish, still on my counter, still foil covered, and I put it straight in the trash without opening it. I was afraid. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't. The permanence of it had pressed itself against me. The real possibility that I would grow old without my son. That I would have Christmases alone and no one to call when I couldn't open a jar. But here is what the fear did. It made me more certain. Because I understood that if I capitulated now, if I reopened the payments out of loneliness or guilt or the wish to make the fear stop, I would be back here in 2 years, in 3, in 5. I would be 75 or 80 with fewer resources and the same dynamic, only worse. The fear was real, and the fear was pointing at the truth. I called Dorothy. "They came," I said. "I figured it was soon," she said. "Are you all right?" "I'm all right," I said. "I just needed to say it to someone." The mortgage application came to light 3 weeks later. I wouldn't have known about it at all if Patricia hadn't called me. My niece, Frank's sister's daughter, the one in banking in Cincinnati. She called on a Tuesday evening, and her voice had that particular careful quality that means someone is choosing their words in real time. She said, "Marjorie, I want to be careful about what I tell you, because some of this touches on professional matters, but I think you need to know something." What she told me, slowly and with appropriate disclaimers, was this. Kevin and Tiffany had submitted a mortgage application on a house, a 4-bedroom in a suburb of Columbus with good school ratings, approximately 8 weeks before Kevin had sent me that message. The application had included, in their income documentation, a record of regular monthly transfers from my account to theirs, going back 3 years, not as loan repayments, listed as consistent family income supplement. The application had been moving through processing, and then, on the month my payments stopped, it had stalled. Patricia didn't know all the details. She was being careful not to share anything she shouldn't. But she knew enough, and she cared enough about me to make the call. I thanked her, and sat for a long time with the phone in my lap. So that was the shape of it, seen whole at last. Kevin and Tiffany had been using my consistent payments as a documented income source on a mortgage application. When I canceled, when the money stopped arriving on the 15th, the application had run into trouble. The school district remark from last fall, the new furniture, the sudden need for things to be normal between us, it assembled itself into a timeline I could read clearly now. The message, "Don't ever call me again," had been sent 8 weeks into the mortgage process. A clean break, perhaps intended to be temporary. Perhaps they thought they'd close on the house, then mend fences with me once they no longer needed the income on paper. Or perhaps they'd simply miscalculated, assumed I would keep paying out of habit and love regardless of their silence. I would never know which. What I knew was this. It wasn't grief that had sent that message. It wasn't years of frustration or a genuine need for distance. It was a transaction. I had been managed. I brought all of this to Martin the next morning, including Patricia's account. Martin was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "Marjorie, are you aware that submitting false income documentation on a mortgage application is a federal offense?" "I'm aware," I said. "Do you want to do anything with this information?" I had thought about this the night before, lying awake in the dark. I had gone back and forth. What I had settled on was not revenge, not in the way that word usually means. It was something closer to accountability. "I want Kevin to know that I know," I said. "Nothing more than that. No lawyers, no reports, not yet. I want to look him in the eye, and I want him to understand that I'm not the person he thought I was." Martin helped me draft a letter. Not threatening, not accusatory in legal terms. Simply factual. I have become aware, through reliable means, of certain documentation submitted in connection with a recent financial application. I believe you should know this information has come to my attention. I wish to meet and speak with you once, in person, in the presence of my attorney. We sent it certified mail. Kevin called me the same day it arrived. His voice, this time, was entirely different from any version I'd heard before. Not the fake warmth of the kitchen visit, not the tight control of the rent call. Something stripped back. Something that sounded, honestly, like a young man who understood that something had caught up with him. "Mom," he said, "what is this?" "It's a letter," I said. "I think it's quite clear." "Who told you? How did you—" "Kevin," I said. "I'd like us to meet. In Martin's office, as the letter says. I'd like Tiffany to be there as well." Silence. "I'm not trying to destroy you," I said, and I meant it. "I am not calling a federal agency. I am not contacting the mortgage company. I just need you to sit across from me, in a room, and be honest with me. For once." He came. 3 days later, a Thursday, a gray November morning. He and Tiffany sat on one side of Martin's conference table. Martin and I sat on the other. Tiffany had clearly been crying recently. Her face had that tight, overcomposed quality of someone who has been crying and then carefully repaired. Kevin had aged in those 3 days in some way I couldn't entirely quantify. I had notes on the table in front of me. I didn't use them. I said, "I want to tell you what I know, and I want you to let me finish." They both nodded. I went through it. The message, the payments, the timeline, the mortgage application, Patricia's call. I said it all calmly, without raising my voice once, looking at my son the whole time. Not at Tiffany. At Kevin. He was the one I needed to reach. When I finished, the room was very quiet. Tiffany began first. She said the transfers had been listed as family support income, which she claimed was a standard documentation category. She said she'd consulted with their application broker about it. She said a lot of words, and underneath all of them, I heard, "We found a technicality, and we used it." Martin looked at her without expression. Then Kevin said something I hadn't expected. His voice was quiet. He said, "Mom, I know what it looked like, and I know you're not. I know you're not wrong." Tiffany turned to look at him. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on me. "Was any part of it real?" I asked. I had promised myself I would ask exactly that question if I got the chance. The Sunday visits, the pot roast, any of it. He didn't answer right away. His jaw moved. His eyes went wet. Not dramatically, just a slight gleam. "Yes," he said. "At the beginning. Before." Before what? I didn't ask. I understood. Before Tiffany, or before whatever version of himself he'd become inside that marriage. Some combination that I wasn't equipped to fully unravel. "Then I'm grieving something real," I said. "And so should you." The mortgage application was withdrawn 2 weeks after our meeting in Martin's office. I don't know who made the decision, Kevin or Tiffany, or the two of them together at their kitchen table in Columbus on some evening I can't picture. The house in the good school district went to someone else. I know this because Patricia told me, carefully, that the file had been closed. I did not report anything. I did not contact the mortgage company or any federal agency. Not because I had been lenient or soft. Martin and I had discussed it thoroughly. But because I had achieved what I needed to achieve. I had made Kevin understand that I knew. I had made both of them sit across from me in a room and be unable to pretend. In some forms of reckoning, exposure is sufficient. But other things followed, and they followed on their own. 2 months after the meeting, Kevin called me. Not for money, not to make arrangements. He called at 7 in the evening, and he sounded the way he used to sound when he was younger, and something was wrong, and he needed his mother without knowing how to ask for it. He said he and Tiffany were having some difficulties. He didn't say more than that, and I didn't press. "I hear you," I said. "I'm sorry, Mom." And this time, there it was. The word, undecorated, unstrategic. For the message, for all of it. I know that doesn't... He stopped. Started again. "I know that doesn't fix anything." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't fix it. But it's still good to hear." We talked for 40 minutes. It wasn't the conversation that would repair everything. I knew that. Repair, if it came, would come slowly and in pieces. But it was a beginning of something, and it was real. What I had control over, I took control of. What I didn't, I let be. The financial picture also resolved in ways I hadn't expected. After canceling the recurring payment, I'd begun reviewing my accounts more carefully, something I'd been loose about for years, assuming everything was fine and keeping my attention on Kevin's needs instead of my own. What I found, working with Martin and a financial advisor he recommended, was that I was in better shape than I'd feared. Frank's pension was stable. The house was paid off. I had a modest but real investment account I'd barely touched in a decade. I was not wealthy, but I was solvent. I was fine. I made some changes. I set up a small automatic transfer to a travel fund, something I hadn't done since Frank passed. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, something I'd thought about for 15 years and always postponed because there was always something else. I went to Dorothy's for dinner every Friday. I kept going to the Wednesday evening group, and I did the thing I'd always wanted. In the spring, April, when the maples were just starting to go green again, I adopted a dog, a beagle mix, 7 years old, from the county shelter. His name was already Walter, and it suited him so completely that I kept it. Walter had brown eyes and enormous ears, and he slept on the foot of my bed and walked with me every morning around the block. Frank would have found a way around his allergies. I knew that the moment I put Walter in the car and he put his head out the window. As for Tiffany, what I learned in the months that followed came to me in fragments, not all at once, and not because I sought it out. From Kevin, eventually, from Patricia once or twice. Tiffany had, it turned out, pushed for the house. Had pushed hard. The mortgage application had been her initiative, and the documentation strategy, listing my transfers as income, had been something she'd discussed with a broker on the edge of legitimacy. When the application fell apart, things between them had deteriorated in ways I wasn't told the details of. I didn't feel satisfaction at that. I want to be honest about that. I felt something more complicated, a sadness for my son, who had made choices that had cost him, and something quieter underneath it, which was, this is what accountability looks like. Not dramatic, not punishing, just consequences arriving in their own time, at their own pace, in their own form. Martin sent me a note 2 months after the meeting. It said simply, "Well handled, Marjorie. Frank would be proud." I put it in the front pocket of my purse, next to the folded piece of paper where I'd first written down $133,650. I kept both of them there for a long time. Spring became summer, and summer passed gently. I started the watercolor class and discovered, to my genuine surprise, that I had some aptitude for it. Not brilliance, I wasn't going to have a gallery show, but something real. My instructor, a soft-spoken man named Hugh, who had studied in Vermont, told me I had a good instinct for color and restraint, which felt like the best compliment I'd received in years. We painted landscapes mostly, the creek behind the community center, the grain elevator on the edge of town, the maples on my street in their October peak. I gave Dorothy the maple painting for her birthday. She cried. Walter became the organizing principle of my mornings in the best possible way. Up at 6:30, out the door, around the block, and then to the park 3 streets over, where the other dog people gathered without formal arrangement, drawn by routine and the common language of leashes and mud. I knew their dogs before I knew their names. The small poodle named Clementine, the enormous brindle thing called Hank, the ancient basset hound whose name I never caught because his owner always called him, "You ridiculous creature." I became a regular. I became known. It was a small life in some respects, but it was fully mine, and I had forgotten, somewhere in the years of Frank's illness and its aftermath and the slow project of Kevin's dependence, what it felt like to inhabit my own days with that kind of ease. Dorothy and I took a trip in July. We'd been talking about Savannah for years. She had family there. And we finally just booked it. 5 days, a bed and breakfast in the historic district, walking tours, restaurants we couldn't afford in our regular lives, but could afford for 5 days if we were careful. I drank sweet tea on a wrought iron balcony and watched the Spanish moss move in the evening breeze and felt, with unexpected force, that I was lucky. Specifically, concretely lucky. Not in an abstract gratitude journal way. Lucky in the sense of having been given more than I'd earned. Kevin and I had found a kind of careful equilibrium by then. He called on Sunday evenings, which he'd started doing sometime in June, and the calls were 20 or 30 minutes. Nothing strained, nothing forced. We talked about Walter, mostly. Kevin had always wanted a dog, and Walter was a reliable neutral topic that slowly became something warmer. In August, Kevin came to Dayton alone for a day. We had lunch at the diner on 5th Street, where Frank and I used to go on Saturday mornings. We didn't talk about the money or the mortgage or the message. We talked about a book he was reading and the drought that had hit Ohio that summer and the fact that he'd started running, which surprised us both. He hugged me at the car when he left. I didn't make a thing of it, but I held it close afterward, the way you hold something that might be breakable. I did not ask about Tiffany, and he didn't offer. I understood she was no longer in the apartment in Columbus, but the details were not mine to know. What I understood, from the little Kevin said, and the spaces around it, was that the weight of the past year had come down on her in particular ways. The mortgage failure had strained them. The meeting in Martin's office had changed something she hadn't expected to be changed. She was a woman who was very good at managing appearances, and what had happened in that conference room, being seen clearly, in full light, without the protection of the performance, had apparently been something she couldn't recover from quickly. I don't say this with pleasure. I say it as a fact I observed from a distance. I saw her once, by coincidence, in November. I was in Columbus for Patricia's daughter's birthday party, and I stopped at a grocery store on the way. Tiffany was in the bread aisle. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. We both stopped. She looked tired, not beaten. Tiffany was not the kind of person who would let you see beaten, but tired in the way that comes when the architecture you've built your life around has required too much maintenance. I said, "Hello, Tiffany." She said, "Marjorie." Neither of us moved for a moment. Then I said, "I hope things are going better for you." And I meant it. I genuinely meant it. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't read. "Take care of yourself," she said. We went in opposite directions down the aisle. I thought about that exchange all the way home to Dayton, Walter asleep across my lap, the November fields dark outside the car window. I thought about what it would have felt like, a year earlier, to see her and feel the complex terror of her, the anxiety about whether I'd said the right thing, managed the impression correctly, maintained my position. I felt none of that. I just felt mild and even and ready to get home to my yellow house. Dorothy had soup waiting when I got there because I'd called her on the way and she was Dorothy. We ate at her kitchen table and I told her about the grocery store. "How did it feel?" she asked. I thought about it. "Like running into someone I used to know," I said. "Someone I'd known pretty well, actually. But a long time ago." Dorothy refilled my bowl. "That's growth," she said. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it's just time." "With you," she said, "those are usually the same thing." Outside, the maples had gone bare, and the first real cold of winter was settling over Ohio. Inside, the soup was warm, and Walter, who'd followed me from the car, was asleep under the table with his chin on Dorothy's foot. I was 68 years old. I had lost a husband and, for a time, a son. I had given away more than I should have for longer than I should have, because I had loved someone without seeing clearly what I was loving. I had sat in my yellow kitchen on a March morning and read a message that should have broken me. It had not broken me. I had an orchid on my kitchen windowsill, a beagle with enormous ears, a watercolor of maple trees I'd painted myself, and a drawer full of Sundays I intended to spend exactly as I chose. I called it a good life. I called it mine. So that's the story. All of it. I learned this. The moment I stopped waiting for someone to tell me I was allowed to protect myself was the moment I actually could. What would you have done in my place? Leave me your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story meant something to you, pass it on to someone who might need it. I'm grateful you listened this far. Take good care of yourselves.